Andrew Masters from the Fiscal Affairs Department of the IMF. This CD talk focuses on supporting revenue administrations to operate through the COVID-19 pandemic, and more specifically with respect to business continuity planning. We have two guest speakers today. The first is Mr. Werner Ovale. Mr. Ovale is the Director General of Guatemala Customs and newly elected Vice Chair for the World Customs Organization's Americas and Caribbean region. Mr. Ovale holds a legal and social sciences degree from Rafael Landovar University and 3 master's degrees in politics, public safety, and integration and development from the Senior Management Program at the INCAE Business School. Mr. Ovale has extensive experience in Central American integration process, risk and information analysis, and interinstitutional coordination developed over his 19-year career in the public sector and with international organizations. Mr. Ovale is a supporter of the national policy to prevent and combat fraud and customs smuggling. Mr. Ovale will discuss his experience in Guatemala with the IMF's Mr. Azael Perez, a senior economist and customs specialist. The second speaker is Mr. Fatuhullah Jamil. Mr. Jamil is the Commissioner General of Taxation and leads the Maldives Inland Revenue Authority, the MIRA, in the administration of the tax system of the Maldives. He is a qualified chartered accountant with a wide range of experience in tax, auditing, and accounting. Mr. Jamil has served at the MIRA from its establishment in 2010 until 2016, when he broadened his experience in the private sector. He was an integral part of the team that first introduced a tax system in Maldives in 2010. Mr. Jamil brings his expertise from an audit, tax, and risk management background to the table in formulating regulations and policies that the MIRA implements, and also brings his expertise in serving as a member of the MIRA's board of directors. Mr. Jamil will discuss his experience in the Maldives with the IMF's Ms. Susan Betts, a senior economist and tax specialist. Before we proceed, let me advise you how to ask questions of any of the presenters. Please note that all mics are muted for the duration of this CD talk and will remain that way. However, please use the Q&A facility by typing in your questions, and at the end of both presentations, I will ask the presenters on your behalf. We also won't be using the raise hand facility. I suggest that if you have a specific question for Mr. Ovale, please put Guatemala first and then your question. And if you have a question specifically for Mr. Jamal, please put Maldives first dash and then your question. That'll just facilitate things and make it a bit easier for me. Let me now ask Susan Betts to get the ball rolling by setting the context for today's CD talk. Over to you, Susan.
Thank you, Andrew, and welcome everyone. Urgent or important? How would you characterize business continuity planning in your administration? Would your answer have been different before the pandemic? You have likely heard of the urgent versus important matrix, which is a model to help us prioritize our work for better outcomes. Urgent issues demand our immediate attention, while important issues are generally more strategic in nature and contribute to achieving our long-term goals. If we always spend time on the urgent, we will never have time for the important. While this may be acceptable in the short term, you may be compromising the achievement of your long-term goals. Or in the case of the current pandemic, you could be risking your ability to carry out even the most critical revenue administration functions that you are responsible for. The pandemic has certainly taught us about our vulnerabilities as tax and customs administrators. How can we continue our business operations, protect the safety of staff and citizens, maintain revenue collections, support supply chains, and in some cases implement and manage the government support and stimulus packages while in the midst of a pandemic. Without business continuity planning, it is infinitely more difficult. But planning for unexpected events is broader than just planning for managing through a pandemic. The range of risks that could disrupt operations include a fire, a flood or other weather-related incident, a cybersecurity attack, data loss, loss of telecommunications, among other possible events. Each of these risks needs to be thought through and actions identified beforehand that can be put in place immediately if that event does occur. One of the keys to an effective response is a business continuity risk is quick action. If an administration does not have a business continuity plan, they may now realize that developing one is no longer simply important, but urgent. The Fiscal Affairs Department has been working with countries since the pandemic to respond to requests for assistance in business continuity planning and in recovery planning. In some cases, the support has been to develop a pandemic business continuity plan. In other cases, we have helped countries plan for the full range of possible business continuity risks. What we have observed through this work is that countries who have been able to respond more quickly are those with a good IT infrastructure and internet capabilities, as well as having access to laptops to facilitate work from home. Countries who only have manual processes and their documentation is paper-based will find it difficult to maintain operations during a pandemic. As many countries are now facing a second wave of the pandemic, those administrations with mostly manual processes need to act now to identify how they can carry out their critical tax and customs administration functions. These critical functions could include dispersing government support payments, protecting the supply chain, and issuing legitimate refunds so business owners have access to much needed cash to keep their business viable. As challenging as the pandemic has been, it could present an opportunity for countries to advance their digitalization agenda, to provide more taxpayer services electronically, and move more quickly to e-filing and e-payment. This will help minimize the impact of a possible future event. I hope that after today's session, you will agree that having a business continuity plan is important and perhaps even urgent to prepare the organization to respond to an event that disrupts business operations. I encourage you to avoid the risk of allowing urgent operational issues to prevent you from implementing business continuity planning in your administration. To talk about their experience of operating during the pandemic and lessons learned in business continuity planning, we are going to profile two country cases today, one that had a business continuity plan and one that did not. The first is Guatemala, which requested help to review its existing business continuity plan against the realities of the COVID-19 pandemic and to help design a business recovery plan. The second case is the Maldives, who did not have a documented business continuity plan. We helped them to identify the full range of possible business continuity risks through a systematic approach. They are now working on drafting their own business continuity plan with periodic support from the Fiscal Affairs Department. So let's hear first from the Guatemala Customs Administration. Azael, I'll now pass it over to you.
I will switch to Spanish. Muchas gracias, Susan. Bienvenidos a todos.
Thank you so much, Susan. Welcome, everybody. It is a pleasure to participate in this panel, which is so important for all of us. I would like to start by saying that the COVID crisis has had important repercussions on international trade. And in May, our exports shrunk by 25% and our imports shrunk by 26%. This has obviously resulted in less revenue for most customs administration. The pandemic has also pointed out how important is the role of customs in order to smooth the transactions and also the provision of medical supplies for the pandemics. All this has put a lot of pressure on customs, which need to carry out their work in real time and nowadays with the least possible interaction with physical operators. This new context, in addition to what Susan has just mentioned, gives us a general idea about the challenges faced by our customs administrations. I would like to thank Mr. Ovalle, who is here with us this morning, and I would like to start by asking him, how did the COVID crisis affect external trade and the revenue of the Guatemala customs? Good morning, Asael. First of all, let me thank the IMF for the invitation to participate in this event. I would like to share that in my country, we never stopped operating our customs, although on March 15, our borders were closed to people, but we continued having trade. We had to adopt social distancing and protection for our staff, and we had to increase telework by 75% in the operations. In view of the operations that we recorded, we also started direct coordination channels with other government agencies and with the private sector. We tried to avoid, to the extent possible, the contact between operators. As you mentioned, the drop in external trade impacted negatively our economy, and it also affected our tax revenue. In Guatemala, external trade represents 47% of the GDP. VAT represents 51% of total VAT, and the revenue of customs is 29%. This year, we had a reduction of 15% in the level of trade that arrived in Guatemala. So we had an 11% drop in our revenue as compared to 2019, and also a reduction of 11% in the VAT. Thank you so much, Mr. Ovalle. With regard to the advice provided to you by the IMF, which are the key points of this advice which helped us? First of all, I would like to say that the support we received from the fund was very timely. They were very agile, and this allowed us to have a more strategic point of view. I think that many customs were surprised by the pandemics, and it was very different depending on what capacity we had to react. And this is the value added by the assistance provided by the IMF. The assistance provided by the IMF is characterized by the fact that they work hand in hand with our staff, and therefore the advice provided is adapted to our reality. This is how we were able to identify clearly the measures we had to take before the crisis. I would like to say that an institutional committee was created for the crisis administration, and this allowed us to have an idea from the legal point of view and the administrative point of view, and something very important, which was what would we do with the human resources in our institution. I can, for example, mention that the assistance helped us adjust our annual plan in order to face the challenges produced by the pandemic. We also had methods in the customs administration, and this also allowed us to facilitate the import of goods. In this scenario of the pandemics, we had several crisis scenarios across all institutions. So in some, the IMF's technical assistance helped us to prepare better to mitigate the effects of the pandemics. Thank you so much, Mr. Ovalle. And now, speaking about the recovery, Guatemala is starting to slowly recover its economic activities. How did the IMF's support help you redefine a plan for the recovery stage? Yes, we were able to identify the essential operations, and we also identify who were the winners and losers in this crisis in order to prepare new plans which would be carried out during the recuperation. Many of these measures will allow us to recover the level of trade and the level of tax revenue this year and in the coming years. Part of the projects on which we are working at the regional level, for instance, the technical assistance of the IMF for Central America, Panama, and the Dominican Republic, is exactly the customs risk. And due to the pandemics, this has become crucial for customs. We have to avoid all illicit trade, which could make the situation worse. As director of the Guatemalan Customs and as president of the Customs Association for the Americas and the Caribbean, we should all prepare business continuity plans which are solid, especially in countries which are vulnerable to natural catastrophes, such as my country. This will allow us to be prepared when something like this sanitary health crisis occurs. I also want to point out the value of working in a coordinated fashion at the regional level. This will allow us to obtain better results and will work even better if we can count on the support of specialized international organizations. On this occasion, I want to thank the IMF for its technical assistance during these difficult times. This allowed us to analyze clearly the situation, the possible repercussions from different points of view, and what is more important, to have the necessary elements to make our decisions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Ovalle. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. We hope that this will be useful for other institutions. I will now give the floor to Andrew.
Great, thank you very much. And I'd like to now hand it over to Sue, who will be posing a number of questions to Mr. Jamil from the Maldives. Over to you, Sue.
Thank you, Andrew. And thank you, Mr. Jamil, for being with us today. Perhaps we can start with some background on Mira and your operations before the pandemic.
Established in 2010, Mira is still relatively a young tax administration. Significant part of Mira's work over the past decade has been in the implementation of taxes and education of new taxpayers. In January 2020, a new income tax act was implemented. Considering the several standalone tax legislations and under one act, and making the system more comprehensive. Along with this, in recent years, we have been shifting our focus towards implementing international standards and best practices of tax administration at Mira. As a country, the Maldives is highly dependent on tourism-driven revenue. As of now, roughly 70 to 75% of revenue, directly or indirectly, comes from the tourism sector. Mira itself collects approximately 75% of government revenue, a fact that makes efficacy of Mira's work highly important. As a country with a geography of about 1,000 small islands, accessibility of our services is a priority. The distance between islands make it difficult to come to the capital for services all the time, which is why Mira has invested a lot of time and money in digitalizing our services and processes. As a result of the digitalization effort, in 2019, 75% of all the returns submitted to Mira were online. 80% of total collection to Mira was paid online as well.
Thank you for that background. Let's talk a bit about Mira's response to COVID in terms of the lockdown and to what degree Mira was able to maintain its operations during the pandemic.
To curb the spread of COVID-19, government offices were closed to the public from 19 March 2020. We got essentially a one-day notice of this lockdown and short time to prepare. Mira's senior executive team is quite a dynamic and responsive team, and the team quickly coordinated to find solutions to address the situation. I will briefly explain some notable actions we took. We identify key staffs in all the areas and resources in available laptops to ensure all functions were covered. These staffs are then provided all required accesses for work from home. We started providing services such as registration, installment, fine relief, tax clearance, and others through email applications. This previously required signed physical documents. The deadline for filing and payment were also extended for the convenience of taxpayers. As Mira's call center was not operational during lockdown, Mira launched a help platform on Viber messaging service for taxpayers to send questions or ask for help. Assistance to taxpayers also continued across all social media platforms such as Facebook and Twitter, and also via email. Education effort, training, and assistance in filing the returns were provided online via methods preferred by the taxpayers, whether Microsoft Teams, Skype, Zoom, or otherwise. I believe we were able to continue our service with minimal disruption due to relatively larger pool of laptops, capability of our IT team, and flexibility of staff in arranging work.
Thank you for that. Given that Mira did not have a formal business continuity plan prior to the pandemic, what resources did you draw on as you managed through the pandemic?
The quick lockdown required the senior executive team to be quick and making impactful decisions. Some of the things we found very useful in making decisions when we go along were the briefs and papers being published by the likes of OECD and IMF on the responses of tax administration to the pandemic. We also have a very good relationship with IMF and SARTEC, and reached out to them for assistance in formulating the business continuity plan, a request which IMF generously catered to. Well, I would say our response was timely and quite well executed. A comprehensive business continuity plan would have saved a lot more time and made the implementation of these changes a lot easier.
That's great that you were able to adapt quickly to the situation. Perhaps you could share with us what the impact has been for Mira of better understanding the full range of business continuity risks.
Since I started back at Mira as the Commissioner General in 2019, I have been trying to move the organization to a risk-based approach. So it was an opportune time to work with IMF experts to develop our business continuity plan. During the process, we realized that our risk rankings were not as we had initially thought. Some areas we thought we were doing well as we had not faced any problems to date. We realized the risk for some of these areas were also very high. With the implementation of new Income Tax Act in 2020, more taxpayers and more confidential data will be managed at Mira, including information we received through exchange of information with other jurisdictions. And this requires stronger data protection. And the business continuity plan mission highlighted the fact that cybersecurity is one of our biggest risks and one we need to devote more resources to. We also identified Mira's weaknesses in terms of risk mitigation for our information technology related risks and the need to address them quickly. The IMF support was very important in starting our work on the business continuity plan. Mira now has a risk register with risk prioritized based on the likelihood and impact. For me as the Commissioner General, this is important because I now have a well-researched document I could look at when deciding on resource allocation, when asking for funding, and also when prioritizing our objectives for upcoming periods. One of the key takeaways from this mission wasn't just that the risk or register. It was also the fact that our team came out with the knowledge to further develop the business continuity plan on their own. The mission was conducted with full engagement from senior executive team, which I believe would also lead to higher accountability on their part. IMF has offered their assistance in following stages as we build our full business continuity plan. And we look forward to further working with them on specific risk mitigation activities as we develop our business continuity plan.
Perhaps one final question. What advice would you have for peer administrations who may be considering developing their own business continuity plan?
Yes, business continuity plan is not something that is absolutely essential to the day-to-day running of organization. It is usually overlooked when prioritizing work. The issue of this is when situation gets so bad to the extent even day-to-day functions cannot be carried out. The business continuity plan is one of the most important pieces of work or document in the organization. Taking the experience that many of us faced during the pandemic, I think it is a good time to consider the time, effort, and money that could have been saved in many ways. We all had a comprehensive plan in place already. While we might not had a full plan to tackle a pandemic, even mitigating activities we had previously identified for other areas could have been helpful. As an administration that is currently working on the business continuity plan, I want to share that this project has shown that even as we all battle through a pandemic, there are several key risks and issues that require our parallel attention and energy. It is easy to be focused on a situation like the pandemic while unintentionally neglecting other areas which might need our attention, and having full risk register and a business continuity plan would certainly help in keeping our focus grounded. And if you are looking to develop your business continuity plan, I also highly recommend seeking the expertise of parties such as the IMF, as the business continuity plan is a plan that takes significant time and effort to make. And if you are investing that much resources into it, you want to make sure you are doing it well.
Well, thank you very much for that advice. I'm sure your colleagues from the other administrations will value these lessons learned. Now I'm going to pass it back to Andrew to open up the question and answer period.
Well, thank you very much, Sue, and thank you to our two speakers, Mr. Ovai and Mr. Jamil, for sharing your country experiences. I'm sure that many of the attendees have appreciated hearing how you've dealt with aspects of business continuity planning. I have a question now for Mr. Ovai with respect to Guatemala, and the question is as follows. Have you considered the establishment of digital solutions to make revenue more efficient regarding special taxes in products such as alcohol, or a system that can contribute to reduce illicit commerce? Mr. Ovai, over to you.
Sí, muchas gracias por la pregunta.
Thank you very much for your question. And yes, that is part of the efforts that we're currently making. Precisely, the idea is to facilitate the actions taken by importers when they try to pay their taxes. That's a strategy that we have been working on with the IMF. You supported us as we implemented our plan to modernize customs operations. But in view of the crisis, we are automating processes. So in terms of these specific taxes, yes, we are working to open up that facility. And also, this will encourage voluntary compliance. And that is something that is of great interest to us. We want to promote voluntary compliance, and that is exactly where we are focusing our institutional efforts. And that within the framework of TADAT, that is something we have been working on with the fund. So we hope that in the upcoming months, we will be able to begin to operate with that platform so as to facilitate payment of those taxes. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Mr. Ovai. Another question here for the Maldives, Mr. Jamil. How did the Maldives taxpayers respond to their tax obligations during the pandemic? Did they still file and pay taxes based on the adjusted deadlines? Mr. Jamil.
Yeah, thank you. Most of the industries which are highly impacted, considering Maldives being the tourism-dependent country, and also we had about a quarter of a year lockdown. Some of the taxpayers still facing difficulties, but most of the people are paying based on the new adjusted deadlines. But for those who cannot pay on time, we are making arrangements with them to have a flexible payment plans so that they can still we can manage the compliance level of them. So our main target is not that to keep the compliance level at par without it decreasing. So for those who cannot actually, considering the situation, those who cannot make the payments, we are making payment plans for them so that they can pay upfront payment and adjust during the period forward. So from a large part, since most of the filing and payments are also online even before, most of the people still pay, but for those who cannot, we are making plans for them.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Jamil. I have another question now that's really open to both of you, Mr. Ovai and Mr. Jamil. This question goes as follows: how can middle-income countries and emerging markets deal with the issue of the decreasing revenue levels because of the pandemic? Now, before you answer that, I just want to plug an initiative that the IMF will be launching quite soon, the COVID-19 Ideas Exchange, and this is certainly one of the topics on the revenue administration front that we will be covering in a little bit more depth in terms of allowing countries to share what they've done. But this is a good question, and I put it to both of you. So just to repeat it, how can middle-income countries and emerging markets deal with the issue of the decreasing revenue levels because of the pandemic? Perhaps we can start with Mr. Jamil and then ask Mr. Ovai for his input. Over to you, Mr. Jamil.
Yeah, even middle-income countries and countries like Maldives, which are highly dependent on tourism revenue. If we talk about the numbers, roughly about half of our revenue is gone. So basically, initially, which we planned, we might be able to collect half of it. So how can we actually cater to that? One of the main initiative taken by the Ministry of Finance is reduction in expenditure, but there is so much that you can reduce expenditure on. So, and also in a hard time like this, if the government stops all the expenditures, then the economy will be still becoming very slow, and there isn't much economic activities going on. So one of the things the government is taking is taking expenditure reduction measures and focusing on the operational expenditures. And the main initiative or the main work that the government is carrying on is trying to generate some funds from abroad as well, the likes of IMF and World Bank, and also some other donors and through bilateral relations as well. So the reduction of this much cannot be actually domestically funded as well. So expenditure reduction as well as generating or taking some grants and loans from abroad. That's how which we are trying to manage for the moment.
Great, thanks, Mr. Jamil. Mr. Ovai, if you'd like to speak from Guatemala's perspective.
Sí, muchas gracias.
Yes, and thank you very much. I share what was just said by my colleague, Mr. Jamil. And I think that a lot of the efforts, has to be how you can manage spending. That is something that is being done by ministries of finance, and that is a policy being developed in all ministries within the context of the pandemic. But I think it is important to emphasize that this crisis is also teaching us lessons. In the case of Guatemala, we're looking at how we can strengthen, deepen these efforts, looking at the connection between fiscal revenues, foreign trade. We are trying to be more assertive in our efforts to collect more taxes. And I think that that is something that points out that we have to continue with these efforts, continue working in this direction. Another important thing in economies like ours, like Guatemala's, an important factor is for us to continue to deepen our integration process. The Central American region is the second trade partner, coming in only behind the United States. And now with the pandemic, we see how we have been able to maintain our exports precisely because we have our main partners. They're our neighbors. And that is a lesson. That's something that we need to continue to develop. And also we have to see how we can continue to craft strategies to promote voluntary compliance. That is what we have to work on. We have to make this easier by providing the necessary tools so that we can continue to collect more taxes. That is our mission as an institution. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Ovai. And again, thanks to both speakers to answer this question. Again, I'd like to just plug towards the end of November, late November, early December, the IMF will be launching, as I mentioned, an e-forum called COVID-19 Ideas Exchange, and this on the revenue administration side is the very first topic that we will deal with in a little bit more depth. I have another question now for Mr. Jamil, and this relates to environmental issues. So let me give you this question. Can you talk a little bit about business continuity risks around environmental issues? As many people know, the Maldives is just above sea level, and there's a concern around rising water levels. Has the Maldives considered this risk? And if so, what steps are being taken to minimize the impacts of rising sea level? So this is a crisis that's rather more gradual than something such as a pandemic or a fire or a malicious attack on IT. Be really interested to hear your answer in this respect. Over to you, Mr. Jamil.
Yeah, I think this question should be answered in both as a nation what we can do and as a tax administration what we can do as well. As one of the world's lowest lying countries, it is true that we will be among the first to feel the impact of global warming and climate change. Over the past several decades, the sea level has been rising, leading to issues such as the erosion of land and vegetation, flooding, and unprecedented weather. With about 80% of Maldives living with 100 meters from the sea, this is not something we can ignore. Some of the ways Maldives try to minimize the impact. We are trying to build dams around cities to break the impact of waves, upgrading drainage systems in cities and islands that experience flooding, implementation of low emission and energy programs, building of climate resilient infrastructure. Actually, one of the major incidents which hit most part of the Asia was 2004 tsunami, which had huge impact on Maldives as well, economically as well as smooth operation of the government and businesses as well. For such events, we need to have, for tax administration, for example, the 2004 tsunami actually had hit capital city as well, for which we actually lost power for a certain period of time. So for those kind of risk, we need to have mitigation plans like geo-redundancy, probably setting up a duplicate system of ours in another location or another island, or investing in more cloud or other higher technology infrastructures as well.
Great, thanks very much, Mr. Jamil. A question here for Mr. Ovai, Guatemala. How important is coordination with neighboring countries when developing a business continuity plan? A good question. Over to you, Mr. Ovai.
Sí, muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Coordination with our neighbors is essential, especially because, as I was saying, we are involved in an integration process. And because of that, our coordination with neighboring countries is essential and compulsory. Why? Because this allows us to come up with an integrated continuity plan. In that way, we can coordinate so as to assure reciprocity. if, as a country on our own, we create conditions to keep our borders open, if our neighboring country doesn't do something similar. So the whole idea is to communicate and coordinate these mechanisms via dialogue with neighboring countries, and that is absolutely essential so as to be able to come up with a shared view, and so we can have a multidimensional perspective that allows us to have better results in terms of operations, and also it improves our relationship with all players that are part of this continuity plan. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mr. Ovae. A question here for Mr. Jamil of the Maldives. Do you have any advice for other revenue administration leaders on how to balance the urgent operational issues that frequently arise while managing a revenue administration with the important issues such as business continuity planning? How did you make time to undertake the business continuity planning during the pandemic? Mr. Jamil.
Mira is a relatively small organization, so we are luckily in a position to be able to regular monitoring and evaluation of performance across our functions. What regular evaluation ensures is that we always have some ideas of how we are performing on a function and are able to address issues before they get too bad. I also think this helps us to focus on our resources and time for better outcomes. Of course, they are competent and responsive team who are proactive in the work really helps when such situations arise. In terms of making time for the BCP planning, due to the time difference, most of the meetings were held after our office hours, but still our team made time for it. I think this was proof of the commitment of senior management to this project and their dedication to see the project through. Like I mentioned before, business continuity plan development is a work that involves a lot of time and resources, and such compromises might be required as you work against time to implement it. Situations like pandemic, when we actually facing the difficulties, and it will be difficult to implement those changes. But if we have in advance a business continuity plan, then even if we come across any other such situation, we will be in a better position to handle, even if we didn't cover that specific risk in the plan.
Thanks very much, Mr. Jamil. I have one last question here for Mr. Ovae, and this is in respect of customs. So regarding the recovery plan, could you give some examples of concrete measures to improve customs compliance? Over to you, Mr. Ovae.
Señor Ovalle, tiene usted la palabra. Thank you. First of all, we created a manual with instructions which allowed us to project from the customs point of view of which were the measures that were being taken and which would be the measures to be taken by each one of the external trade players. This helped us clarify in a moment of uncertainty what would be the measures to be taken and who would take them. This, in turn, helped us increase the number of electronic services that we give importers and exporters, precisely to avoid that many of the issues that had to be dealt with in person in the tax offices were automized. Many of these processes were turned into automatic process, virtual returns, for instance. So now nobody has to come to our tax office personally to make their payments. So 1 month after the country was closed, we were able to turn this process into an automatic and digital process. We also implemented this electronic system in order to establish and carry out the tool that would allow us to trace customs declarations virtually. The objective of this is that all interested parties in certain goods of any declaration that has been presented would be able to know what was the status of such goods at the harbor, and this in order to minimize consultations in person at the customs office and to limit the contact between the importers or exporters with our customs staff. And this was through the tool of our virtual new system. On the other hand, in addition to the examples that I have mentioned, such as concrete measures to improve voluntary compliance, we have created dialogue mechanisms with the players. We have done this in virtual spaces with importers, exporters, with the chambers of the private sector, precisely in order to have feedback which goes both ways with regard to problems that have appeared during these operations. And we also receive feedback on our demand that everybody should use all protective equipment such as face masks and hand sanitizer. All this is also very important. And something else that I had not mentioned before, with this voluntary compliance, we considered that it was important to establish a communication strategy precisely in order to inform the public on the strategic measures that we were implementing precisely so as to inform our citizens. And this has been quite important because we were able to reach out to an important part of the population. This shows our transparency, and it also helped us maintain everybody informed, including our customs agents throughout our internal website of communications, in order to avoid any uncertainty and so that everybody would know that we are working in accordance to a specific plan. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ovai. And we're now at the end of the CD Talk session. So I want to thank both speakers, Mr. Ovai from Guatemala on the customs side of things and Mr. Jamil from the Maldives on the tax side of things. We really appreciated your input and the sharing of your experiences today. Also want to thank my colleagues from the IMF, Susan Betts and Azael Perez, and also to the 97 attendees that we had. Appreciate you making the time to listen in and hear what's been happening in the two countries that we heard presentations on today. So thank you very much, and we look forward to the next CD Talk. So see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.